The next topic that we're going to cover in this course is strategies for encapsulating a component's external behavior. So I've got a simple example here of an application that has a button that opens a modal when you click it. So when we go ahead and click this open modal button, you can see that the modal opens here, and when we dismiss the button, it closes. The way this works right now is really very simple. We have a click handler on the button that sets modal open to true in this parent component, and that modal open property is what controls whether the announcement modal should be showing. We also listen to a close event that the announcement modal fires when we click the dismiss button that sets modal open back to false. Let's take a look at the announcement modal itself. So again, it's very simple. It's just a bunch of markup that shows when it's supposed to be showing, and when you click the dismiss button, it calls a dismiss method, which emits a close event. So one thing that this modal doesn't currently do that's pretty common behavior in most modals is to close when the user presses the escape key. So here if I have the modal open, if I hit escape, nothing happens. The only way to close it is by pressing dismiss. So how can we go about implementing this behavior? Well, the first thing you might think to try is using Vue's key down event handling to add a key down listener to the modal itself. So say we had this div here which shows the actual modal card, and we tried to add an @keyDown.escape handler that called the dismiss method whenever the user pressed escape. Let's try opening the modal and pressing escape now and seeing what happens. It still doesn't close. Still, the only way to close it is by pressing dismiss. Now, the reason for that is that key events like key down can only be captured by focusable elements. And right now, our actual modal window is not focusable. You can see the button is focusable, and that's why we get this blue ring around it, but the actual modal itself can't be focused. Well, one way that we can add focusable behavior to the modal is to give it a tab index. So if we give it a tab index of 0, all of a sudden it'll behave like buttons and inputs and stuff where you can actually focus it. So if we go ahead and open the modal now, you can see that when I click it, we get a blue ring around the modal as well, which means the modal is now focused. If I press the escape key, the modal closes. So we're getting there, but this still kind of sucks. It sucks that you have to go ahead and actually click this modal before you can hit escape and have it close. And it also sucks that we're getting this outline style on the modal. The modal isn't really focusable because we actually want the user to be able to focus it. It's only focusable so we can listen for the key event on it. So we're probably going to want to update our CSS to make that outline style actually not show up. So we can do that by scrolling down to our styles for the modal, and maybe when the modal is focused, so we can say modal focus, we can give it no outline so you can't actually see that it's focused. Now you can see that that blue outline went away, and as long as we've clicked into it and it's focused, when we hit escape, it'll close. Now we still have this problem of when we open the modal, if we try and hit escape right away without clicking anything, well, it doesn't work because the modal doesn't have focus. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we can try and autofocus the modal every time it opens. So let's take a look at what it would look like to implement that. So down in the script section of our component here, we want to be able to basically say, whenever the modal is opened, focus the modal. So the only way that we can do that is by adding a watcher on the show prop, so we can run some code whenever the value of show changes. So if we add a watch section to our component here, and we watch show, and when we get the new value of show, we check its value to make sure that it's true. Well, here, we should be able to focus the actual modal element. So to do that, we need a reference to the modal. So if we head up here, right where we have class equals modal, let's add a ref to grab the actual modal DOM element. And now down here in our watcher, you would think we could do something like this, .refs.modal.focus to try and focus the modal. Let's see if this is working. We'll go and open the modal, hit escape. For some reason it's not closing. Let's get rid of that outline style that we added and check to see that it's actually being focused. We'll comment that out. And now if we head over here, close the modal, open it again, you can see we're not getting that blue line, but if I click, we are getting that blue line. So even though we're trying to focus this element, it's not actually receiving focus. I wonder why. Well, the reason for this is that here in our watcher, after show changes, Vue hasn't actually updated the DOM when this code runs. It's running this code as soon as the value of show changes, not after Vue has actually done another update cycle and re-rendered the component based on the new state of show. So if we want to run code that runs after the re-render, the way we do that is by calling this.nextTick to run some code after the update cycle. And now if we try to focus the modal in here, well, with any luck, when we dismiss this modal and open it again, we can see it's automatically focused. So if we head back to our styles and bring back that focus style, you can see now that the modal doesn't have that blue line around it, and when we open it, we can press escape and it'll just close right away exactly as we want. But to me, something doesn't feel really great about this solution. All we really wanted to do was register a key down listener that closed the modal whenever the person pressed escape as long as the modal was open. But to do that, we had to add a tab index to the modal, making it focusable and also making it part of the tab navigation in the browser. We had to add a ref to this element so that we could go ahead and focus it anytime it opened through this watcher. And we also had to add some CSS to suppress the focus styles because we don't want the user to actually realize that the window is focused, because really, we don't actually want to focus the window. That's just an unfortunate implementation detail of how we had to make this work. And we had to do all this work and introduce all this complexity around focus and tab index to get all of that happening. So what's another way that we could solve this problem without this additional complexity? Let's take a look at another solution. Let's get rid of this watcher entirely, and instead, let's add a created lifecycle hook so we can run some code as soon as this modal component is created. Inside of this hook, I'm going to add an event listener to the global document object. So we're going to call document.add event listener, and we're going to listen for the key down event. And then whenever that event is fired, we want to run some code. In this case, we want to double check that the key that was pressed is the escape key, and we want to make sure that the modal is currently being shown. And if both of those are true, then we want to call this.dismiss to close the modal. Let's head over to the browser and refresh, open the modal. If we hit escape, it still closes. Perfect. If we head up to our template, we can get rid of this tab index stuff now because we're not relying on that at all. So let's save that and double check that things are still working, and they are. We can get rid of the keydown.escape listener directly on the modal element. And if we refresh, things are still working. We can get rid of this ref because we're not using it at all anymore. And we can even get rid of this extra focus style since the modal is never actually being focused now. Let's refresh and double check one more time that everything is still working, and it is. So let's talk about this solution a little bit. Now, instead of having some code spread out in the template, some CSS that we had to add, and introducing a watcher, all of the code that we needed to write to handle closing this modal dialog on escape all happens in one place. And we didn't have to introduce this unfortunate implementation detail of making sure that the window is secretly focused for us to be able to add the key down listener to it. Now you might be saying to yourself, whoa, isn't this bad? Isn't this like how we used to write JavaScript back in the day? This doesn't feel like I'm writing idiomatic Vue code. It doesn't feel like I'm using the features of Vue to build my interface. And that's actually a very common apprehension. The whole goal of Vue is to let you write your interfaces in a declarative, reactive, component-driven way. So when you have to drop down to the sort of bare metal here and start adding global event listeners to the document, it can definitely feel like you're doing something wrong and that you're coloring outside of the lines. But the reality is that this is actually perfectly idiomatic Vue. Think about it again. The goal of Vue is to let you write these declarative, reactive, component-driven templates. But Vue can't do everything for you automatically. But that's actually the beauty of this whole component-driven approach. Because if you look at what we've done here, we've taken this behavior of listening for the escape key and closing the modal whenever it's pressed and baked it into the modal component itself. From the perspective of the wrapping app component, it doesn't have to know anything about the fact that there's a global document event listener or anything. All that behavior is neatly tied up and baked inside of this component. So from this component's perspective, from one layer up in the abstraction tree, everything still feels like a very declarative, reactive, component-driven approach to building these interfaces. You just drop this modal in wherever you want to use it, and that behavior is neatly tucked away inside of it. So even though we're relying on some sort of bare vanilla JavaScript features to do this, it's totally okay, and it's totally still idiomatic Vue. Now, if we want to go all the way with this and make sure that our implementation is bulletproof, we're going to want to remove this event listener when the modal is destroyed. So Vue has a destroyed lifecycle hook, just like on created. And in here, we can do any cleanup work that we want to do. So we could try and do something like documents.remove event listener, and the listener we want to remove is a key down listener, but somehow we actually have to get a reference to the event listener that we want to remove. So there's two ways that you can handle this that I think are both okay. The first option is to store the event listener as state on the component. Now you don't want to store it as reactive state because it doesn't need to be reactive state. So you don't need to put it in the data section of the component. Instead, you could just do something like this .escape handler equals, and then paste in that event handler. And then down here, we can just bind this .escape handler instead of duplicating that function. And then down here in destroyed, since we now have a reference to it, since it lives on the instance, we can remove the escape handler this way. So this is a totally valid solution that the Vue core team supports and encourages, but there's another approach that I think is equally valid that I actually prefer. The thing I don't like about this solution is we're adding instance state to the component for no real reason other than the fact that we need to be able to access it in this destroyed hook. There's another way to register lifecycle hooks in Vue without using these methods though. So watch this. We can do this .once, which means run this code only once when this event is fired the first time. And then we can listen for the hook destroyed event. And now we can register a callback here. So here we could take the document.remove event listener code and move it up inside of this callback. And now we can actually get rid of this destroyed hook. More than that, since all of this is happening inside of the same scope now, we don't actually have to assign this function to the instance. Instead, it can just be a simple local variable. So instead of referencing this .escape handler here and this .escape handler when we're removing the event listener, we can just reference this local variable and everything will still work. So if we go ahead and refresh, we can open it, close it, and we're good to go.